Before she could even take a deep breath, a flight attendant stood over her and said, "You need to move. This section is only for first-class passengers." She was confused and held up her ticket to show that she was where she was supposed to be, but the woman didn't even look at it. The flight attendant then did something that no one saw coming. She raised her hand and slapped her. Gasps filled the cabin as people froze in their seats. What shocked the flight attendant was that the woman she had just put down was married to the airline owner. Before we start the story, let us know where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The boarding area was busy with travelers checking their phones and drinking coffee while they waited for their turn to board. Eliana stood near the gate with one hand on the handle. Despite being 7 months pregnant and resting on her stomach, Raphael insisted that she fly first class to stay comfortable. It was a long trip, and he didn't want her to feel squished in an economy seat. The airline staff at the counter had been friendly and willing to help if she needed it. Everything had seemed fine up until now. As she stepped onto the plane, her heart began to calm down. The cabin was sleek and quiet, a big change from the crowded economy section she had just been through. She quickly found her seat, 1B. She sighed with relief as she sank into the soft seat and adjusted a small pillow behind her back. Finally, she could relax. But the moment didn't last long as a sharp voice cut through the air. "Ma'am, you must be in the wrong seat." Eliana looked up to see a flight attendant standing next to her. Her name tag said Miss Parker, and she had a stiff posture that made her seem unapproachable. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her lips. Eliana reached into her bag and pulled out her ticket. "I'm in seat 1B, she said in a calm voice. Miss Parker snatched the ticket from her hand, barely glancing at it before handing it back. "First class is for premium passengers." "Are you sure this is yours?" A few nearby passengers turned their heads, but no one said anything. Eliana could feel their interest. She stood her ground and tightened her fingers over the armrest. "Yes, it's my ticket," she said. Miss Parker sighed heavily and shook her head. "Did someone buy this seat for you?" Eliana asked. It wasn't the words that hurt, but the way she said them. She had seen that look, that tone, that assumption. "My husband booked it," she answered. Miss Parker's lips twitched as if she were holding something back, and her eyes flickered to Alana's stomach and then back to her face. "I'll have to check with the front desk in the meantime. I'll need you to move to economy so we can." As boarding was complete, Alana's face got hot, but not from shame or anger. "You can check, but I'm staying in my seat," she said. The attendant's expression darkened. "Ma'am, I don't have time for this. If you refuse to move, I'll have to call security." More passengers turned their heads. Whispers were spreading across the cabin, Miss Parker said. Some shifted uncomfortably, others avoided eye contact. Eliana stayed still, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. "Call whoever you need to," she said. "But I'm not moving." She lowered her voice a little and flared her nostrils. "Listen, I don't know how you bought this ticket, but let's not make this difficult. You don't belong in first class," she said. Alana's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what shocked her more, the rudeness or the cruelty of the words. "Excuse me," she asked, keeping her voice steady even though she was upset inside. Miss Parker didn't blink or get up for a second. Eliana wondered if this was real and if this woman really thought she was in charge. To take her away without even checking the facts, but before she could say anything, Miss Parker raised her hand and slapped her. The sound shook the cabin like a whip, and gasps filled the room. A woman across from her, Mrs. Caldwell, whispered, "Oh my God, and a businessman sitting near the aisle adjusted his tie awkwardly, looking away as if he hadn't just seen what happened. Eliana's head snapped to the side, and her cheek hurt from the blow. When Miss Parker hit her, her hand instinctively went to her face, stinging the skin where she had been hit. The pain was sharp, but the shock was worse. The flight attendant straightened her uniform, her face cold and unaffected. "Get out of this seat before I have you physically removed." Eliana's fingers shook, but not from fear. She had been humiliated before, but this was different. She didn't argue or yell. Instead, she reached for her phone and quickly typed a message. "Slack me and." Then she hit send. Eliana kept her eyes forward, her heart beating fast. The sting on her cheek was going away, but the shame was still there. She had always been told to keep her cool and choose her battles wisely, but this was worse than anything she had ever been through. Miss Parker stood over her, still waiting for her to move, not realizing what she had just said. The cab was silent, with people looking at each other nervously, as if they hadn't seen what had happened. Everyone was looking at Eliana, but she didn't react at all, at least not in the way Miss Parker thought she would. Instead, she sat there with her hands folded over her stomach and her phone resting lightly in her lap. The message had been sent, and now she just had to wait. A vibration on her leg told her she wouldn't have to wait for long. She looked down at the screen and saw a single text from Raphael. "What did you just say?" she typed quickly. "The flight attendant slapped me," the message sent instantly, and 3 dots appeared. Then a second message came through with the flight number. Eliana carefully copied the information from her ticket, and as soon as she hit send, she felt her whole body relax a little. It was no longer in her hands. Miss Parker tapped her foot impatiently. "Ma'am, this is your last warning. Either you move or I'll have someone come take you out of this seat." Eliana let out a slow breath and turned her head to look at her directly. "You should call whoever you need to call." Something in her tone made Miss Parker hesitate. She shook her head and quickly turned on her heel, marching toward the front of the plane. People were whispering to each other, and the tension in the row across from her was rising. Mrs. Caldwell leaned in and asked, "Are you all right, dear?" Eliana forced a polite smile and said, "I'm fine." She wasn't really fine, but she wouldn't let it show. The overhead speaker cracked open, and a voice could be heard. As Eliana looked toward the front of the plane, her heart started to beat a little steadier. She had a feeling that Miss Parker had just made the worst decision of her life. Miss Parker stiffened at the announcement, snapping her head toward the cockpit. The flight had barely started boarding, and already she was being called to the cockpit. That never happened. A flight attendant wasn't called to the cockpit unless something serious was going on. She shot a glance back at Eliana, who was sitting calmly in her seat. It was strange that she wasn't arguing or freaking out. Most people would have made a scene by now, but Eliana was just waiting. Miss Parker quickly turned and walked toward the front. As soon as she disappeared into the cockpit, there was a low murmur in first class. "Did she really slap her?" One man in the aisle seat whispered, "I saw it," and another passenger muttered, "Clear as day." Mrs. Caldwell, who was still watching, gave Eliana a slow shake of her head. There were rumblings in the cockpit, but Eliana didn't respond because she had already done what needed to be done. The pilot, Captain Hughes, was sitting in his chair, but his normally calm face had turned serious. Next to him, on the in-flight phone screen, was an airline manager named Mr. Calloway, who was in charge of flight operations. Miss Parker cleared her throat and crossed her arms over her chest, saying, "You needed me, Captain." Captain Hughes didn't waste any time, and neither did Miss Parker. "Just got a call from the executive office saying that a flight attendant assaulted a first-class passenger. Would you like to explain that?" Miss Parker's stomach dropped. The word assault made the situation sound so much worse than it really was. She hesitated and then forced a shrug. It was just a minor discipline issue. She wouldn't move seats, that I handled. Mr. Calloway's voice came through the speaker. I handled it by putting your hands on a passenger, Miss Parker said. Sir, I replied. I was enforcing the rules, because she was in the wrong seat in first class. Captain Hughes looked at Mr. Calloway, and then asked in a tone that made Miss Parker's stomach tighten even more, did you check her ticket before telling her to move? Miss Parker's lips parted slightly, but she didn't say anything. Captain Hughes leaned forward and asked, did you even check to see if she was in the wrong seat before you touched her? Miss Parker swallowed hard. She had thought she had. Mr. Calloway's voice cut through the tension like a blade. You took Eliana Reyes from her seat. Do you know who her husband is? Miss Parker's breath hitched a little. That name, why did it sound familiar? Captain Hughes didn't make her wait for the answer. Her husband is Raphael Reyes, the owner of this airline. The color left Miss Parker's face, and the hum of the plane seemed to be pressing in on her from all sides. You just assaulted her. Miss Parker, you did it in front of a full first-class cabin, Mr. Calloway said in a deadpan voice. Miss Parker, your hands went cold. We have direct orders from Mr. Reyes. You are to return to Mrs. Reyes immediately, publicly apologize in front of the passengers, and escort her back to first class with full service. When this flight lands, you will be reporting directly to the executive board, Mr. Hughes said. Miss Parker barely heard the last part. Her mind was already there. After embarrassing Eliana Reyes and touching the owner's wife, Miss Parker's career was hanging by a thread. As she stepped out of the cockpit, her hands felt cold and her legs felt surprisingly weak. As soon as she walked back into the first-class cabin, she could feel the change in energy. The whispers and sly looks from other passengers became more obvious. Just minutes before, she had been in charge and yanked a pregnant woman out of her seat without a second thought. Now, she was the... Miss Parker sat down next to Eliana where she had been left, her face calm but unreadable. Her phone was in her lap, with her fingers lightly resting on the screen as if she had all the time in the world. Miss Parker swallowed hard and leaned back as she knelt next to Eliana's seat. The shame of what she had to do burned through her pride, but there was no way out of this situation. She cleared her throat and said, Mrs. Reyes, there was a misunderstanding. Eliana's eyes lit up. The flight attendant's throat tightened as she thought about the weight of the other passengers watching to see how she would fix what she had done. Yes, Miss Parker, she said again, but this time her voice was lower. I'd like to personally escort you back to your original seat in first class. Eliana tilted her head slightly and asked, Are you saying it was a mistake? Miss Parker nodded stiffly. Yes, there was. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. An error in seating. Eliana didn't blink an eye. There was more silence between them than usual. Eliana leaned forward and lowered her voice just enough for Miss Parker to hear. You didn't check my ticket, you didn't check the seating chart, you saw me, and you decided I didn't belong here. That wasn't an error, that was a choice, she said. Miss Parker's skin pricked at the accusation. She knew it was true, and worse, the other people on the plane knew it too. One man in first class cleared his throat awkwardly and said, it would probably help if she. A few people in the cabin agreed with her. Eliana didn't smile, but something in her eyes sharpened, and she leaned back and folded her arms to apologize. Miss Parker hesitated for a fraction of a second too long, and Eliana pressed a formed in Miss Parker's throat. She had spent years controlling situations just like this, making sure people followed the rules, but this time she wasn't in charge. She took a deep breath and forced the words out, "I'm sorry, Mrs." In response to Reyes's apology, Eliana thought about it for a moment before finally nodding, "Okay, I'll go back to my seat." Miss Parker then stepped aside as Eliana Rose slowly adjusted her bag over her shoulder. She wasn't in a hurry and didn't look upset. She carried herself with the same quiet confidence she had when she first got on the plane. As she walked past the rows of first-class passengers who had stayed quiet while she was being embarrassed, there was no gloating or smugness. She had the. While she was sitting in first class, Eliana adjusted the pillow behind her with calm, deliberate movements. Her hands were no longer shaking, and the sting on her cheek was gone. The air around her felt different. The respect she had once commanded from both passengers and crew had gone, and she knew she wouldn't be getting it back. She had embarrassed the wrong person, and she was about to find out how much that mistake was going to cost her. The murmurs had stopped, but the tension stayed. People who had ignored her before were now sneaking looks at her, their faces changing between discomfort and quiet shame. They had seen and heard everything, but no one spoke up when she was being mistreated. Now it was too late. M. Parker stood awkwardly next to her, her posture stiff as if she didn't know what to do next. She cleared her throat, her voice thinner than before. Eliana looked up at Mrs. Reyes and said, "You didn't offer me anything before." Miss Parker blinked, confused. "Excuse me," Eliana said, "when I first sat down." She said it smoothly, "You didn't offer me water, you didn't ask if I needed anything, you didn't even greet me properly like you did with the other first-class passengers, but now you're offering." A few people moved uncomfortably in their seats, and Mrs. Caldwell, sitting across the aisle, let out a small, amused huff as if to say. Eliana tilted her head slightly and asked, "Then what was your intention?" Miss Parker opened her mouth and closed it again, but she didn't say anything. Eliana watched her for a moment longer before finally speaking again, this time in a softer voice, "Now I'll take a sparkling water." Miss Parker quickly agreed, glad to have something to do, besides just standing there feeling bad about what she had done. She ran to the galley and grabbed the tray. The younger flight attendant, Hannah, had been quiet the whole time and was now watching her with an unreadable expression. "That didn't go well, did it?" Hannah said under her breath. M. Parker shot her a sharp glare. "I don't need your commentary," Hannah smirked, leaning against the counter. "I wasn't offering any." M. Parker exhaled sharply, grabbed the tray, and walked stiffly back to first class. Hannah carefully placed the glass on Eliana's tray table, her hands shaking a little. Eliana picked up the tray and. She looked up at Miss Parker and said, "One last time, by the way," in a light, almost conversational voice, "I texted my husband about you." This made Miss Parker's stomach twist, and Eliana watched the bubbles rise to the top of the glass. He wasn't happy, and Miss Parker forced a small, tight smile. "I see," Eliana asked, "do you?" Eliana's eyes met hers, and they were sharp and unwavering. "I don't think you know how much trouble you're in." Miss Parker stiffened and said, "I truly regret how I." Eliana set down her drink and leaned back in her seat. "Good," she said, "because in about 30 minutes, you're going to regret it even more." Miss Parker stood still for a second, then nodded stiffly and walked away. Hannah watched her leave with a mild sense of curiosity, before turning back to Eliana and whispering, "That was impressive." Eliana didn't answer. She just opened the magazine and turned the pages as if nothing had happened, but she knew Miss Parker's worst nightmare was just beginning. Miss Parker walked away. She walked to the galley with her heart racing. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but this was a whole new level of difficult. She had always thought she was in charge and that her authority in the cabin was final, but now she wasn't in charge at all. Her hand shook a little as she adjusted a stack of napkins on the counter while she pretended to be busy. She couldn't shake the feeling that people were looking at her and whispering about her just beyond the curtain that separated first class from the galley. She quickly turned around to see Hannah leaning against the other counter with her arms crossed and a knowing look on her face. "Mind your business," Miss Parker snapped. "Hey, I'm just saying you embarrassed that woman in front of a plane full of people, and now it turns out her husband runs the airline." "Yeah, I'd be nervous too," Hannah said. "It was a mistake," Miss Parker repeated, her jaw clenched. "It was a mistake," Hannah said, tilting her head. "Miss Parker," Hannah said, "I hope you have a plan because we're landing in about 20 minutes, and I don't think Mr. Reyes is the forgiving type," Miss Parker said as she turned away and gripped the edge of the counter. She had thought that taking Eliana back to first class would make things better, but an apology would make things better, but the look on Eliana's face and the way she had handled everything told her otherwise. Things weren't over in the main cabin. Eliana sat back in her seat and read a new text message on her phone. Raphael talked about how the plane would land in 20 minutes and that everyone should be careful. She smiled slightly and locked her phone. The mood in the cabin changed. People who had ignored her earlier were now looking at her with interest, as if they were realizing too late that they had been silent witnesses to something much bigger than an uncomfortable seating dispute. A businessman sitting across the aisle, Mr. Calloway, cleared his throat and leaned slightly toward her. "I saw what happened earlier," he said. Eliana raised an eyebrow and asked him, "Did you see that?" Clearing his throat again, he sounded clearly uncomfortable. "It was unfortunate that her lips were pressed together in a thin line," he said quickly, shifting in his seat. "It was clearly a mistake on the flight attendant's part." Eliana looked at him for a moment and then gave him a small nod. "And yet you sat there and said nothing when it happened," he added. Mr. Calloway's face turned a little red, and he looked down and rubbed his palms together. Eliana let the silence between them last for a while, before turning back to her magazine. The overhead intercom cracked, and Captain Hughes's voice came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. Please make sure that your seat belts are buckled and that your tray tables are upright. We'll be landing shortly." Eliana buckled her seatbelt and stole a glance toward the front of the plane. Miss Parker still hadn't returned, and Eliana didn't know what Raphael had planned, but she did know that M. Parker had made the. She was about to face the consequences of making the wrong assumption about the wrong person. The plane went down smoothly, but the tension inside the cabin was anything but steady. People who had been reading or watching the entertainment were now looking away, stealing quick glances toward first class at IATA and the front of the plane where M. Parker had disappeared. Eliana sat still, her hands resting lightly on her belly and her breathing even, but she could feel the excitement building inside her. Miss Parker was about to find out for herself that Raphael didn't make idle threats. A faint ding echoed through the cabin as the fastened seatbelt sign came on. Flight attendants rushed through their final checks, their voices softer than usual and their energy noticeably tense. The intercom cracked again as the cabin crew got ready for landing. Eliana looked at her phone and saw a new message from Raphael. "Please stay seated when the plane lands and do not move." Miss Parker stayed hidden in the galley, her fingers gripping the counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had spent years perfecting the art of control, keeping order in the cabin with complete authority, but now she felt something she wasn't used to: helplessness. She could already see passengers getting off the plane, security waiting at the gate, and executives waiting to take her aside for a private meeting. Even worse, she had no defense. As soon as the plane's wheels hit the runway, there was a hush over the plane. There wasn't the usual excitement of landing. There was something else in the air, an anticipation that no one could quite name but could be felt by everyone. The intercom buzzed again. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination, local time. The time is 3:45 p.m. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off and the aircraft has reached the gate." The aircraft moved slowly toward the terminal, each second seeming longer than it should have. Eliana glanced toward the galley while waiting for the seatbelt sign to go off. As soon as it did, passengers grabbed their belongings, but no one rushed to stand. Instead, everyone looked to the front of the plane, where a tall, broad-shouldered security officer stepped on, moving with such authority that there was no room for. Questions started to rise in the cabin. Some people whispered to each other, "Is this what happened?" while others sat frozen, watching the scene play out. The officer barely looked around before focusing on one person, Miss Parker. As soon as her name was called, the tension broke, and Miss Parker straightened her body naturally, even though she didn't have any confidence left in her stance. She slowly stepped forward. Yes, the officer's face was unreadable. "You need to come with us." A few gasps could be heard from the back of the cabin. Someone whispered, "Oh, she's done it for Miss Parker." The officer's voice didn't waver. "There have been reports of an incident regarding the removal of a first-class passenger. Mr. Reyes has requested a formal review. You'll need to come with us for questioning." The moment was thick with realization. Passengers who had previously ignored the situation were now fully engaged, some with quiet satisfaction and others with surprise, but no one was complaining. There was silence as no one spoke up to defend Miss Parker. She desperately wanted an excuse, an explanation, anything to lessen the damage, but there was nothing. She had built her reputation on power, control, and authority, and now she was being led off the plane. As she walked down the aisle, she made the mistake of looking at Eliana. Eliana wasn't smiling or bragging, she was just watching, calm and unshaken. This made Miss Parker feel worse, so she quickly turned away and walked toward the front of the plane. Guards stood on either side of her, and people in the cabin exchanged wide-eyed looks. "Rose back," Hannah said, shaking her head. "She really did it to herself?" No one else agreed. As Miss Parker got off the plane, the weight of everything hit her all at once: her job, her reputation, her lack of control, and she had no one to blame but herself. As soon as Miss Parker got off the plane, the bright lights of the terminal felt like a spotlight, exposing her to the world. The security guards stood beside her. They led her through the jet bridge at a steady but firm pace. Each step felt heavier than the last, and she could feel her heart beating faster. People were staring at her, and airport workers were pausing in the middle of their work to keep an eye on her. Immediately, rumors spread like a storm. "Is that her? She's the flight attendant who got in trouble. What did she do? I heard she hit someone in first class." Miss Parker kept her head down, and her usual strong stride had been replaced with a smaller, weaker one at the end of. On the jet bridge, two men in dark suits were waiting. They were airline executives, and one of them, James Cotters, the senior operations manager for the airline, stepped forward and said, "Come with us there." Miss Parker couldn't understand what he was saying, so the officer stepped aside and let the executives take over. She followed them through a side entrance that was out of sight of the public and into a restricted corridor with white walls and security doors. This was the kind of place that passengers never saw. It was the part of the airport that was meant to be secret. For years, she had walked through airports with confidence and a sense of control. Now, she felt like an outsider in a place that had been her domain. They got to a conference room with a long, shiny table and chairs that looked way too stiff to be comfortable. James pointed to a chair, and Parker took it, even though her hands shook a little as she put them on her lap. James then took the seat across from her and opened a folder. There were passenger statements, a report from the captain, and, worst of all, a formal complaint from Raphael Reyes himself. James looked at her for a long time before speaking. "You do realize why you're here, right?" he asked. "I was told there was a complaint about a seating issue." Miss Parker straightened up, trying to hold on to what little authority she still had. "A seating issue," he said, tapping his fingers on the desk. "Miss Parker, you physically assaulted a first-class passenger," he said. Miss Parker swallowed hard and said, "It was a misunderstanding." James closed the folder and said, "The only misunderstanding here is your belief that this situation can be salvaged." The air in the room got heavier as James leaned forward and looked straight ahead. "Let's make one thing clear. If this were any other passenger, you would already be fired. The only reason you're even getting this meeting is because of this. Because Mr. Reyes wanted to give you a chance to explain yourself before we made a final decision." James didn't blink. He said, "Yes, you are suspended without pay until a full review by the board." Miss Parker's stomach dropped. "Suspended, that's right." James confirmed that a final decision would be made within the week, but given the circumstances, I wouldn't get my hopes up. Miss Parker's hands were curled into fists. "I've given 10 years to this airline, you can't just get out of here," James said. "The only reason we're even thinking about a reviewer is because Mr. Reyes believes in accountability. That means that if you take full responsibility, you might, and I mean might, have a chance at redemption." The words hit her like a punch in the stomach. She had spent years thinking she was untouchable and could run her flights however she wanted, enforce her own rules, and control the space. But now she wasn't in charge of anything. If you try to defend yourself or make excuses instead of admitting what you did, this is the end of your career in aviation. James sighed and rubbed his temple. Miss Parker stared down at the table with her throat tight. James stood, signaling that the conversation was over. "You'll be escorted out of the airport, and by tomorrow, a formal letter will be sent to your email." Miss Parker hesitated. She wanted to argue, she wanted to ask for another chance, but she knew it wouldn't matter. A security officer stepped back and calmed her down. A security guard led Miss Parker through the airport's back hallways, where she had walked countless times with James, but she didn't answer. Instead, she walked out with her head down and her stomach in knots. For the first time in 10 years, she had no idea what her future held. She had always been sure of herself and in charge, but now every step felt like a march into the unknown. Her mind was racing, and she was suspended without pay pending a review that she was sure would lead to one outcome. She had spent 10 years making sure passengers followed the rules and was strict, but she thought she had done what was needed to keep things in order. In just a few minutes, she had lost everything because of one impulsive action, but was it worth it? Was it really just one moment, or had it been building up for years? She remembered Eliana Reyes sitting calmly in her seat. The way Miss Parker had looked at her, not with anger or tears, but with quiet certainty, and that certainty had been right. Miss Parker hadn't checked the ticket or the seating chart. She had just looked at Eliana and decided she didn't belong. The thought made her stomach turn. She wasn't led out the normal exit, but to a quiet side exit. Staff members used door 1 when they didn't want to draw attention to themselves, but it was too late for that. As soon as she stepped out into the open, she saw a group of reporters near the terminal entrance. Cameras were flashing and people were looking at their phones. Word quickly spread that she was embarrassed, so she put her head down and hunched her shoulders, desperate to hide from the cameras. The security officer stayed by her side and silently led her to the exit. "Mrs. Reyes, yes." She quickly turned to look at the voice and saw Eliana coming out of the VIP terminal with her hand on her belly next to her. Raphael Reyes stood tall in his sleek tailored suit, his presence commanding without him having to say a word, his expression unreadable, and his sharp eyes locked on Miss Parker like a predator studying its prey. Miss Parker felt her throat tighten because she had never met Raphael Reyes in person, she had only heard his name. He owned the airline she thought she controlled and was talked about in airline memos, news articles, and corporate meetings. Now he was looking at her for the first time since getting off the plane, and Miss Parker felt scared. Eliana turned her head a little to meet Miss Parker's gaze. Unlike Raphael, her expression wasn't harsh or even angry. It was measured, like someone who was already okay with how this was going to end. A deep, calm voice broke the silence. "She's done." Raphael Reyes didn't. Raising his voice wasn't necessary. The words were final. Miss Parker swallowed. She could beg or plead for another chance, but what could she say? She had embarrassed his wife by touching Eliana Reyes, who hadn't done anything wrong and was just trying to sit in the seat she had paid for. Parker took one look at her and decided she didn't belong, and there was no excuse and no apology could change that decision. Eliana's lips slightly parted as if she were going to say something, but she didn't. Raphael followed her without saying a word as the door closed on the black luxury car that was waiting for her. Miss Parker stood there frozen in place as the full weight of what had happened hit her. She had embarrassed someone, and now the world was watching it happen. She had taken someone's seat, and now she was being taken away. She had looked down on someone she thought didn't have power, and now she was being looked down on. It was a bad day at work, and she couldn't fix it with an apology. This was the first time in her career that she had no control over what happened next, because she wasn't walking back onto another plane. Miss Parker stood still in the airport parking lot, her heart pounding against her ribs. The sound of the luxury car's engine faded into the distance, but the reality of what had just happened stayed sharp and unwavering. Miss Parker clenched her fists and breathed in short, uneven bursts. She felt like she had no control over anything. In all her years as a flight attendant, she had never questioned the authority she held in the cabin. It had been her rules, her control, and her word. Today, the same airline she had worked for 10 years had thrown her out without a second thought because of one woman, Eliana Reyes. Miss Parker squeezed her eyes shut, but the images. She couldn't stop thinking about Eliana sitting there in first class and refusing to move, how she had stayed calm even when hit, and how she had handled the situation without raising her voice or demanding attention. What was worse, Miss Parker hadn't realized how wrong she had been until it was too late. She took a deep breath and forced herself to move. She still had to get to her car and make the long drive home, and who knew what was waiting for her there. While she was walking through the parking lot, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and immediately wished she had it. Dozens of notifications. Her name was already on the internet. The story had spread like wildfire. She clicked on one of the notifications, her heart racing. Flight attendant fired after assaulting pregnant passenger in first class. Airline CEO's wife attacked on flight attendant faces backlash. Discrimination in first-class passenger speaks out after being humiliated. Parker's stomach twisted as she read the news. Already, articles, comments, and discussions were breaking down her every move, making her a villain overnight. She had lost her job and her reputation, and the comments were even worse. She should never be allowed to work in aviation again. You could tell she felt entitled when she talked to that woman. Imagine thinking you could hit someone and not get in trouble. Karma Airlines needs to start checking out applicants, because this isn't the first time she's done this. She shook her phone like crazy because it wasn't just about the job anymore. Her name and face were now everywhere, a permanent stain on her career in care. She felt a cold chill as a new, terrifying thought hit her. Even if the airline hadn't fired her, who would hire her now? No airline wanted an employee who had been the center of a viral scandal. She wasn't just losing her job at one company, she was losing her future in the whole industry. Her head was spinning, she had to get home. She shook her hands and put her phone back in her pocket. She fumbled with her car keys to unlock the door and collapse into the driver's seat. She sat there for a long time, her knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. What was she supposed to do now? She had spent years following the rules and working her way up the ranks, so she was sure she was doing her job right. She thought passengers needed to be put in their place, and she had the power to decide who deserved what. She was powerless, unemployed, and hated. She let out a sharp breath, and for a moment, her vision blurred. She had been so sure she was in charge when she told Eliana to move, she was so sure she was right. But now all she felt was regret. Her phone buzzed again, and it was another message from Dominic Reyes about accountability. She held her breath and hesitated before opening the email, her hands shaking. Miss Parker, I'm sure you already understand how bad what happened on Flight 237. I won't waste time repeating what's. People should take responsibility for their actions, and that includes being given a chance to say sorry. I'm giving you that chance now. If you want to formally apologize to my wife, I will make sure she gets your message. But I want to be clear, this apology isn't for me, the airline, or your career. It's for the person you hurt. If you can't bring yourself to do that, I don't see any reason for this conversation to continue. I'll wait for you to do it. Miss Parker read the email 3 times because she wasn't sure if she had the guts to reply. In 10 years, she had never apologized for how she treated passengers, but now it wasn't about keeping her job. It was about whether she was finally ready to admit she was wrong for the first time. She didn't feel angry, she felt empty. She hovered her fingers over the keyboard and slowly began to type the words, "I was wrong, and I'm sorry, Miss Parker." Sitting in her car and looking at the email draft on her phone, she felt like the words, "I was wrong and I'm sorry," were written by someone else. She had never written an apology like this before because she had never needed to. In her 10 years as a flight attendant, she had dealt with thousands of passengers, including rude travelers, spoiled business people, angry parents with crying kids, and people who tried to argue their way into free upgrades they hadn't paid for. Although she always told herself that she was just doing her job, enforcing the rules and making sure everyone knew their place, this wasn't following the rules. It was something else entirely. She knew exactly what she had done when she saw Eliana Reyes sitting in first class. She hadn't thought about rules or seating charts. She had made up her mind before she even spoke to her. She had looked at who was sitting in that seat, not what was on her ticket, and that was the real problem. Her fingers were moving over the keyboard. Could she actually send this? Would an apology even matter at this point? She wasn't naive, she knew that an email wouldn't fix everything. The internet had already judged her, her name was being dragged through every social media platform, and strangers were debating whether she should ever work again, whether she deserved to be fired, and whether she was beyond redemption. She had no control over this situation anymore. For once, she wasn't deciding what happened next. She let out a sharp breath, and her throat tightened. What would be worse? The thought of admitting she was wrong for sending the email or not sending it made her sick. She had spent years thinking of herself as strong and in charge, but now she realized that real strength isn't about control, but about accountability. With a shaky breath, she hit send. As soon as the email disappeared from her screen, her stomach twisted with nerves. She didn't know what would happen next or if Eliana Reyes would even care. She read the email and closed her eyes. Everything had changed in just a few hours. Yesterday she was a respected senior flight attendant, but today she was unemployed, ashamed, and hoping desperately that the woman she had embarrassed would accept her apology. But she wouldn't know until she got a reply, and if Eliana never replied, she would have to live with the weight of that silence for the rest of her life. This was happening There was an executive lounge on the other side of the airport where Eliana Reyes was sitting comfortably with a cup of tea and scrolling through her phone. She wasn't reading emails or the news, she was just waiting. She knew Raphael was taking care of things like he always did, but she wasn't looking for revenge or to see Miss Parker fall. She just wanted to see if she would take responsibility. A soft ding interrupted her thoughts. A new email had arrived. She looked at the sender's name, Vanessa. Parker took a slow breath, put down her cup, and opened the message. I was wrong, and I'm sorry I didn't verify your ticket. I didn't follow proper protocol. I assumed something about you that I had no right to assume. I spent the last few hours replaying what happened, and I keep asking myself why I did that. The answer is what I don't like, but I won't hide it. It wasn't about policy or seeding mistakes. It was about me seeing you and deciding before anything else that you didn't. There's no going back on what I did or taking that moment back, but I promise I will never make that mistake again. You don't have to forgive me or even respond to this. I just wanted you to know that I see what I did, and I am ashamed of it. I am truly sorry. Eliana let the words sit there for a moment, unreadable. She hadn't expected to see people apologize because they meant it, but because they had to. This wasn't defensive, it wasn't shifting. There wasn't even a request for forgiveness, it was just honest. Eliana smiled slowly at the corner of her lips. She didn't need to say sorry, she had already won, the system was changing, policies were being put in place to make sure this didn't happen again, and Ms. Parker had already been punished. But Eliana still thought people could learn something very simple. She grabbed her phone and started to type, Vanessa, I appreciate your email. I'm not angry anymore, but I hope you understand that. People in the same situation as me have never gotten justice or had a voice. I was lucky that my husband could make things right, but not everyone can. You say you won't make this mistake again. I hope that's true, because I'm not interested in whether you're sorry, I'm interested in whether you change. I won't meet with you, but I accept your apology, not because you deserve it, but because I believe in growth. Eliana Reyes hit send, then quietly picked up her tea. Vanessa Parker sat in the dim light of her car's interior, her phone resting in her lap. Her hands were still shaking a little from the weight of the email she had sent. She hadn't expected a response, and she hadn't even thought she deserved one. But her phone buzzed just 5 minutes later, with a reply from Eliana Reyes. She had stared at the notification for a full minute before getting the courage to open it, and now as she read every word her arms. She felt an emotion she hadn't let herself feel in years. It wasn't forgiveness, Eliana had made that clear, it wasn't absolution, this wasn't something that could be erased with an apology, it was a chance to actually get better, not to get her job back or clear her name. Valentina let out a shaky breath as she read the last few lines of the email again. I'm not interested in whether or not you're sorry. I'm interested in whether or not you change, she had believed for years. She knew that being disciplined and keeping things in order meant she was doing her job well, but had she ever really thought about the people behind those seats, or had she only seen them as things that needed to be moved, fixed, or put back in their place? She briefly looked at her phone and wanted to reply again to ask Eliana how she could fix this, but something told her that she already knew the answer. It wasn't about saying more, it was about doing. As Vanessa took a slow, deep breath, she put her phone on the passenger seat and closed her email. For the first time in hours, she didn't feel the crushing weight of shame or anger, she just felt tired. She was tired of the person she had been and the sense of entitlement she had worn like armor. She was tired of thinking she had the right to decide who belonged where. She rested her forehead on the steering wheel and thought about the time she had snubbed a family for taking too long to settle in first class. The time she ignored a black businessman who politely asked for help but then turned her full attention to another passenger right away. The time she made fun of a woman under her breath for looking too young to be in first class, as if wealth and privilege had a certain look. She had always told herself it was policy and she was just following the rules, but was she really? Or had she been using policy as an excuse for something much worse? Many things she wished she could take back made her heart race, but she knew that regrets wouldn't change anything. She sat up and reached for her phone again, but this time not to call Eliana or beg for another chance, but to take the first real step toward change. She scrolled through her contacts and hovered over the name of a former co-worker, Michelle Rivers, a senior flight attendant she had worked with years ago. Michelle had always been different from her, she had. Michelle pushed for more inclusive training for flight crews and fought to change how passengers were treated. Vanessa had once laughed at Michelle's efforts, but now she realized how blind she had been. She paused for a moment before pressing the call button. The phone rang twice before Michelle answered. Vanessa gasped, "Well, I haven't heard from you in ages." "What's up?" Michelle asked. Vanessa clenched the steering wheel and forced herself to. Michelle's voice softened as she asked, "Are you finally ready to listen?" Vanessa swallowed and said, "Yeah, I think I am." There was another pause, and Michelle sighed, "Okay, let's talk." That was it. For the first time in years, Vanessa Parker chose to learn instead of control. She wasn't looking for redemption or trying to erase what had happened, but she was finally ready to change. Vanessa sat in her car for almost an hour after ending the call with Michelle. Michelle wasn't trying to minimize Vanessa's mistakes, she didn't let her off the hook. If Vanessa wanted to be better, Michelle told her, start by admitting that this isn't just about one mistake, it's about the kind of person you let yourself become. That was the part that hurt the most. Vanessa had spent years following rules, but were they the airline's rules or the unspoken rules in her mind that told her that certain people belonged in certain places? When she finally got in her car and drove out of the airport parking lot, she felt heavy with the truth that even good people can hurt others. The drive home seemed longer than usual. The sun was setting over the cityscape, casting an orange glow. Everything else looked the same as it did that morning, but she wasn't the same. When she got to her apartment, she sat in the driveway for a moment and looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. With a slow breath, she walked out of the building and into her apartment. The silence was deafening. For years, her job had been everything. It had set her schedule, her habits, and her identity. She had spent so much time being in charge that she had forgotten how to just exist without that authority, and now she had no control over what happened next. She took off her shoes and walked into the kitchen, opening the fridge out of habit, As she sighed and leaned against the counter, her phone buzzed. For a split second, she thought it might be another headline, another email, another reminder of the damage she had done, but when she checked the screen, her breath caught, Mom. She hadn't talked to her mother in weeks, not because they were estranged, but because Vanessa had always been too busy with work and making sure the world around her stayed in order. She hesitated before answering, "Hey, Mom." Her mother's voice was warm and full of worry. "Vanessa, I saw the news." Vanessa closed her eyes, but her mother had seen it too. The story was all over the news. "Yeah," her mother said quietly. "I know what happened, sweetheart." Vanessa gripped the counter, her fingers tightening around the cool surface. How was she supposed to explain this? She had lost everything, she had been wrong. It wasn't until it was too late that she realized she wasn't sure if she even deserved forgiveness. Her mother's voice softened as she spoke to Vanessa, "Talk to me, you sound different." Vanessa swallowed. She had spent years thinking she was right and that her version of authority was right. She had learned from strict supervisors and modeled herself after the airline's harshest enforcers, and had never questioned it until today, until Eliana Reyes spoke up. "Mom, I messed up," Vanessa said. It was the first time she had ever admitted her mistakes out loud. "I judged someone, I treated them unfairly, and I didn't realize how wrong I was until it cost me everything," she said. "Do you want to know what the hardest part of realizing you're wrong is?" her mother asked. "Do you want to know what the hardest part of realizing you're wrong is?" Vanessa swallowed. "Knowing that saying sorry won't erase it, but you still have a choice. You can either be the person who—" Vanessa blinked quickly, her vision blurring. "And what if it's too late?" A steady voice from her mother told her, "It's only too late if you refuse to learn." Vanessa pressed her hand against her forehead, feeling overwhelmed by the weight of it all. She had always prided herself on being strong, firm, and never letting her emotions get in the way of her work, but right now strength wasn't about control, it was about accountability. She had lost her job and her reputation, but maybe just. Her mother's voice pulled her back, and Vanessa took a deep breath and gripped the phone tighter. "What are you going to do now?" her mother asked. Vanessa stared at the blank wall in front of her for the first time in years. She didn't have an answer right away, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to be the same person she was yesterday. That person was gone. Vanessa lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment. What were you going to do? After 10 years, she had nowhere to be in the morning, no uniform to iron, no flight schedule to check, and no passengers to direct. The job that had defined her life was gone, and now she was left with nothing but herself. She rolled over on her side and reached for her phone out of habit, but hesitated. For so many years, her notifications had been full of flight schedules, crew messages, and work reminders. Now, all she saw were news articles, comments, and judgment from other people. Vanessa Parker, an ex-flight attendant, is facing backlash after assaulting a passenger in first class. The article wasn't even close to as harsh as the comments. She should have been fired, she should go work as a burger flipper for a change. The problem is that people like her don't realize they're wrong until they get caught. I hope she never gets hired again. Vanessa forced herself to read every word. The angry version of her from yesterday would have been reading this. She could have defended herself or made excuses, but now she realized something painful: they were wrong. She had spent years looking down on other passengers, thinking that authority gave her the right to decide who deserved respect and who didn't. She had made people feel small for years and never stopped to think about what it meant. She put her phone away and covered her face with her hands. Eliana Reyes was the victim here, but what really bothered Vanessa was not just that she had made one person feel bad. The thought of how many people had felt disrespected because of her and how many had gone home wondering why they had been treated differently made her sick to her stomach. She had enforced a culture she hadn't even realized she was part of. She had thought of herself as someone who kept things in order, but in reality she had been part of the problem. She slowly let out a breath while sitting up in bed. She could spend the rest of her life feeling bad about herself. Eliana had said, "I'm not interested in whether or not you're sorry. I'm interested in whether or not you change." For the first time, Vanessa understood what Eliana had really meant: systemic discrimination in the airline industry. She reached for her laptop and hovered her fingers over the keyboard before typing "systemic discrimination in the airline industry." The results flooded the screen, and she clicked on the first article, then another, and another further. As she read about implicit bias training and racial discrimination lawsuits against airlines, she heard from passengers who had felt invisible, unheard, and ignored, and with every word, she felt something inside her shift. She had always thought she was fair, but being fair wasn't just about following the rules, it meant questioning the rules themselves. Vanessa leaned back in her chair and stared at the screen. She could either disappear into obscurity, she could let her mistake define her and the world remember her as a shame, or she could use this experience to change herself. Maybe she would never work as a flight attendant again, and she might never get back the respect she had earned, but that didn't mean she couldn't make things right in some other way. Her fingers moved again, but this time she typed an email to an organization that fights discrimination in travel, not Raphael Reyes or the airline. She was willing to learn. I'm Vanessa Parker, and I worked in the airline industry for over 10 years. I was recently fired because of how I treated a passenger, because of my own biases. This experience made me face the truth about my actions and the bigger problems in this industry. I don't expect sympathy or a second chance at my job, but I want to do better. I want to learn. I want to help. If there's any way I can help educate others, advocate for change, or share what I've learned from my Vanessa Parker read the email 3 times before sending it. The message disappeared, but she wasn't relieved yet. Things wouldn't change overnight, and people wouldn't have a different view of her all of a sudden, but this was the first step. For the first time in her life, Vanessa Parker wasn't looking for control, she was looking for accountability, and that was finally something she was willing to fight for. For the morning sun poured through Vanessa Parker's small apartment window, casting long streaks of golden light across the wooden floor. She hadn't slept much, but for the first time in years, it wasn't because she was stressed about schedules, crew assignments, or passenger complaints. It was because she was questioning everything she thought she knew about herself. She had built a career on the idea that she was strict and kept things in order. She kept things running smoothly by making sure everyone followed the rules and respected the airline structure. But she had never stopped to think about who made the rules, who decided who belonged where, or why she was so eager to enforce something she had never thought about. Now there were no flights to get ready for, no crew members looking to her for leadership, and no uniform to press before stepping into the world with authority. She was just Vanessa. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table with her laptop open. The email she had sent to the Travel Equity Organization was still fresh in her mind. She didn't know if they would respond or even take her seriously, but she had done something she had never done before. She had reached out not for her own benefit but because she wanted to learn. Her phone rang. When she checked her screen, she caught her breath. There was a new message from Equal Access in Aviation. Vanessa clicked it open. Ms. Parker, we received your email and appreciate your honesty. It's not often that people in your position take responsibility without being forced to. Vanessa then replied. We would be open to a conversation. We are hosting an upcoming seminar on bias in the airline industry. If you are willing, we would like you to join as a person willing to share their story, not as a speaker, to show how systemic problems affect real people and to talk about what it means to really change. This isn't about clearing your name, it's about learning. If you're really ready, we'll give you a place to do that. Let us know if you're interested. Best of luck with Equal Access in Aviation. Vanessa let out a sharp breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. They weren't giving her a chance to clear her name, they were. As she closed her eyes, a heavy feeling settled in her chest. She wasn't sure if she deserved a second chance at her job or at being seen differently. But maybe it wasn't about what she deserved. It was about whether she had the courage to sit in a room full of people who had experienced the kind of discrimination she had ignored for years and listen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. She could leave, she could fade into the background. As the years went by, she could either let the world go on, get a new job in a different field, and act like none of this had ever happened, where she could face the uncomfortable truth about who she was and make a promise to become a better person. With a deep breath, she typed the 2 words, "I'm ready," and this time she meant it. A year later, the conference room was full of airline employees, from flight attendants to executives, all listening carefully as the speaker at the front of the room clicked to the next slide on the projector. The words addressing bias bin. A necessary conversation about first-class travel. Vanessa Parker sat at the far end of the panel, with her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't the speaker. She wasn't here as an expert or an advocate. She was here as a former enforcer of bias who had chosen to learn instead of defend. When it was her turn to speak, she took a deep breath, picked up the microphone, and looked out at the room of people who were just like her a year ago, thinking they were just following the rules. "As I thought I was doing my job," she began. She wasn't trying to be fair. Instead, she was enforcing an invisible system of discrimination that she never stopped to question. The room went silent as the weight of her words hit them. She hadn't come here to get sympathy. She had come here to make people see what she had been blind to. As she spoke, she knew there was one thing she could never change. What she had done to Eliana Reyes would never be undone, but maybe she could stop it from happening to someone else, and that was a start worth taking. If you like this story, please click like and let me know what you think in the comments below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on alerts so you never miss a new video.